A year of public anger. Millions around the globe took to the streets in 2019 to vent their anger against governments. What's behind this global dissatisfaction? And is this action making any difference? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami, Zeidan. The year 2019 will be remembered for the wave of protests that swept the world, with millions of people protesting to demand change. Often those demonstrations turned violent. Security forces killed in some countries like Iraq and also used extreme force, leading to the deaths of several hundred people. In Hong Kong, the use of tear gas and live ammunition became common. Each protest movement had its own reasons, but they were united in their demand for democracy and fairness. Hong Kong's protests began in June against plans to allow people to be extradited to mainland China. Fighting between police and activists have become increasingly violent, with police firing live bullets and protesters attacking officers and throwing petrol bombs. People are demanding less influence from Beijing and the resignation of the leader Carrie Lam. Bolivia saw its biggest protests in decades following a disputed election in October. President Evo Morales had declared himself the winner of a fourth consecutive term, but protests forced him to step down and seek asylum in Mexico. Fighting between government supporters and Morales' opponents led to more than 30 deaths. In Iraq, people started protesting against corruption, unemployment and poor public services. But that escalated into a demand for the whole political system to be overhauled. Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi resigned in November, but he stayed on in a caretaker role until Parliament agrees on a successor. More than 400 people died in weeks of violent protests there. And anger over corruption and sectarian politics led to protests in Lebanon too. Demonstrators are demanding the end of the sectarian system and the appointment of a politically independent premier. The unrest forced Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri out of office in October, but he remains caretaker. Tens of thousands of Algerians took to the streets in February. That's after it was announced longtime ruler Abdelaziz Bouteflika would run for a fifth term in office. Protests led to his resignation in April. Presidential elections were held in December, despite many boycotting them. Demonstrators say the newly elected president's appointment is illegitimate. They're calling for the entire political system to be changed. In France in November, thousands of yellow vest protesters took to the streets over rising fuel prices and the high cost of living. The demands grew to include the resignation of the president. There were scenes of destruction and chaos across Paris. Police fired tear gas and water cannon on demonstrators after they built barricades and set fire to cars. In India, a controversial citizenship law sparked anger and protest nationwide. The legislation offers illegal migrants of religious minorities from 3 neighboring countries the right to become citizens of India, but excludes Muslims. That's seen by many as an attack on the constitution. Protests against it have been worst in the northern state of Uttar Pradesh. At least 19 people have died there in the past 2 weeks. Let's bring our guests into the show then. We have joining us here in the studio in Doha, Marwan, Bishara, Al Jazeera's senior political analyst. Remi Bourgeot is an associate fellow at the French Institute of International and Strategic Affairs. He joins us from Istanbul. And Mohammed, Cherkaoui, senior researcher at the Al Jazeera Center for Studies. He joins us from Brussels. Welcome to all of you. If I could start with Mohammed in Brussels. So, were there actually more protests around the world in 2019 than in previous years? It certainly feels like it when we're covering the news.
Definitely there has been an increase in what we can call turbulent politics and collective action of the bottom-up forces versus the weakening top-down political institutions. For example, in Lebanon, it's not just about the rejection of the situation by those young protesters, but also a decline or a loss of momentum among the various political elites through different nominations. So we are looking at this global wave. It seems to have spread across the global south. Then if we add the French case, that becomes more of a worldwide phenomenon. But definitely, I think it's not just about the causality that we witnessed in 2011, where people were asking for welfare and social justice and dignity and things like that. But now I think we have stepped into a higher level, which is a rejection of the status quo, the political institution of the state, either in the East or in the West. I think we are now beyond the causality of 2011, and I think now we need a better approach to understanding what's exactly the momentum, where it's leading us, and the trajectory, in a way that most protesters are asking for a complete renewal of the political class, and I think most of the political elites are old enough not to have this vision or this new way of thinking.
Okay, interesting. Let me bring it to Marwan here in the studio. And I think when Mohammed was referring to the causality of 2011, of course, I think he's talking about the Arab Spring. We're looking at things, though, in a slightly larger sort of global context, because we've seen protests right around the globe, haven't we, from the Americas to Europe. Although each country, Marwan, has its own specifics, can we say that there are some common denominators? I like Mohammed's expression there about the bottom rebelling against the up. Is that one way we can kind of tie this all together in?
Well, two things. One, I think for once in our lifetime, for at least of this network, let's give some credit to the Arabs. At last, the Arabs in this century are able to export something that's incredibly great to the rest of the world. And that was the spirit of the Arab Spring. That was the idea of a popular mobilization, the idea of non-ideological per se, not narrow, wide open, popular mobilization for reform.
Do you think that's what has inspired many other parts of the world?
Absolutely.
In the protests that we're seeing?
But also, of course, we've come at a time of history when this have come, like a couple of years before that, in the Green Revolution in Iran, certainly it's all coming around the time when the so-called social media has become pervasive among people, and certainly a great tool for organizing. Now, to give social media and Facebook and whatever else the credit, of course, is a bit superficial, not to say foolish, because that will not give us the opportunity to understand that what drives these protests. The tool is social media. But if you remember, 40 years ago this month, the protests in Iran and elsewhere were driven by cassettes. I'm sure a lot of our viewers around the world
they might not remember what
cassettes
are, but yeah.
There used to be a cassette. And people distributed cassettes in Saudi Arabia and Iran and other places, where cassettes were the main tool for mobilizing people for popular protests.
Right.
A century ago, it was the printing press in this region that led to the first Arab awakening. Printing press. Well, today it's social media. Now, what is the contribution of social media? Not only popular mobilization, but the more important bit of it, and that's what distinguishes this in the Arab Spring and elsewhere in the world, from Chile to France, is the leaderless
nature of the
nature of
protest
those
movements,
things, because
right.
they happen in terms of organizing in the social media sphere, and hence they have this more democratic nature to them, less leadership aspect to them.
That's a very important point. I want to come back to you on it, but I want to continue the sort of analysis and break it down in terms of maybe some other common denominators before we start to analyze, what else is perhaps driving this. Remi, are we seeing, at least in many cases, can we say the economic order is driving this? Perhaps a rebellion against the economic order that has prevailed in many parts of the world since the end of World War II, but it's seen as just not delivering for enough people anymore.
Well, there are clearly some common economic aspects to those protests. Of course, the political context is quite different from one place to another, and especially if you take into account the political system and the level of development. But there's, of course, a global aspect in economic terms, especially with the crisis of the model of economic growth that has been proponed over the past 30 or 40 years, the kind of liberalization, free trade and financialization. And this clearly hasn't delivered. Now there's a rising awareness of the issue of inequality, but there are really very simple things in terms of asset bubbles, the costs of living, housing bubbles, really affecting people throughout the world. And many of these protesters really mention issues that are really related to this global economic context, and to issues that are actually related to the global financial crisis and its consequences. So it's really striking to see those common issues in countries which have very different levels of economic development, whether Hong Kong, France, and Iraq. And of course, the economic situation and the political situation in all these countries are extremely different. But still, these crises point to some global issues and to this model of development that has been put forward in the past 30 years.
There's always, Marwan, we run the risk, of course, we talk about a broad theme globally of masking the specificities that differ in each country. And we don't want to make that mistake. But is it possible to say here, that it wasn't that long ago where we had stats come out talking about how the global 1% now own more wealth than the rest of humanity. Is that a common denominator in many countries, regardless of how different they are in their economic development, that's feeding into a perception of, I have a lot less than others, and I really shouldn't have this little?
Okay, so generally speaking, when a student of mine would answer the question about any such question, would answer with social, economic, and political, I would say this is the wrong question. Right. This is the wrong answer. Why? Because this is the answer for everything. You give me one phenomena nowadays, and I will tell you, well, it's social, economic, and political. Well, of course it is. But as you were saying, and as Dr. Cherkaoui said earlier, we are going through a very particular phase in history, and I think we need to really pay attention to the spirit of the times, to the climax of the time, beyond speaking in macro terms about economic and social. One is, yes, the growing
inequality, right?
But more
people expect more.
But more importantly, as Dr. Cherkaoui said earlier, I have a feeling that there is a bit of anarchic response, hence the leaderless popular mobilization, to the tyranny of the elites. There's a sense.
Are those dynamics linked? As
Absolutely.
People become more desperate, so does the elite, which wants to keep the order as it is.
But that's why I think this is a response to a tyranny. Not the tyranny of communism or of fascism or that kind of a tyranny, but a tyranny of the elite in sort of kind of an open society, certainly liberalized economies, and so on and so forth, which allows people to mobilize not necessarily in the dark rooms like the radical right does, also in these places like Chile and Europe and France and so on and so forth, but sort of in the open chat rooms of the internet in order to mobilize against the tyranny of the elite. And that is important, especially at this point in time, because it does allow for a certain dynamics for reform. These people who are mobilizing in Chile and in France and in various other places do not want to take over the government. They want the government to reform.
All right, I think Mohammed wanted to come in. Go ahead, Mohammed from Brussels.
I think we need to reflect a little bit on the difference between 2011 and 2019. I think we started with the Arab word, irhal, dégage, get out. This dégagism has become a world phenomenon. It has been copied in 982 cities around the world. However, we should not misperceive the dynamics of 2019 by imposing the scenario of 8 years ago. What I mean by that is that we had dégage or irhalism in 2011 as a rejection of the whole system, while the protesters in Tahrir Square and other public places could not figure out exactly how the trajectory would be like. However, 8 years later, we shifted from irhalism into the will of the people, الشعب يريد. And I think this is a very strong message that now there is a growing inside or within power among those protesters in the streets. And for example, the Algerian scenario is very interesting in showing us how the protesters have maintained a peaceful approach and non-confrontational situation with the army, and therefore there is a smoother transition. However, we are still stuck at 3 levels of social change in the Arab world. We have the uprising at the very bottom, social uprising, we have regime change in the middle, and then we have the higher level, which is revolution. And I disagree with Marwan, we should avoid the term Arab Spring. It's a quite misleading notion, and I think Mark Lynch, who coined this back in his article in Foreign Policy in January 2011, has moved away from this. So it's not an Arab Spring, but there are waves that are different from each other, and I think it's a build-up by considering how these tactics of protests have shaped themselves between 2011 and 2019, and I think within the next 3, 4, 5 years, we may go back to another shift.
Let me bring Remi into the discussion, and I know I'm running the risk of falling into the trap that Marwan pointed we should never do, but let's talk about politics nevertheless, and ask the question, Remi, of, is some of this rebellion, can we say it's in part at least the symptom of the changing global political order from a situation of a unipolar world to a situation where the dominant superpower's influence is weakening or is deliberately withdrawing in some areas?
Well, in the past, they used to appear to be a clear path, following the model of one of the superpowers, and then this liberalizing model that emerged 30 years ago. And there were expectations within populations across the globe and very different political systems that would somehow deliver, and things are much more complicated. There's a sense, of course, those situations again are extremely different politically and also economically, but there's a sense that the elite is not really aware of the solutions, of the way forward to get out of the political and economic impasse of the past decade, in particular since the global financial crisis. And with the social media, the type of organization of those protest movements, it's very decentralized, and there are no clear indications of an alternative model. That's really what's striking in all those protests across the globe. And liberal democracy certainly is being challenged. But what we've seen develop over the past 30 years is not really a model of liberal democracy. It's something quite different. I think liberal democracy is certainly still the way forward for most countries, but we have to redefine those notions, and in terms of economic strategy, in terms of political stability, in terms of the relations between countries, both politically and economically. And there's this whole debate, which is quite anarchic around the globe about free trade and liberalization and all that. But these are really key issues that are being discussed at the moment.
There's a lot to unpack there, but let's take them one at a time if we can. Marwan, let's touch upon a theme that you also touched upon, and that's the leaderless state of this rebellion in many countries. This is unlike the cassette revolution you referred to in Iran, where you basically had one person, Khomeini, talking to people. This is not like other left-wing or communist revolutions
Absolutely.
that use newspapers. You don't have a Fidel, you don't have this charismatic character, Che, talking through radio or newspaper to masses. This is people talking to each other, and yet there is no leader. How can you look at a situation like that and make any projection about where it's going to go? What is the alternative? What is the goal of this rebellion?
Okay, so this is the most important question, I think, of all. The nature of it tells us that it does not have a particular demand to take over government, even if it says irhal, go, dégage. Because even where it says people want that downing of the regime, in the end of the day, what they actually want is the change. The regime to be changed, at least to change its ways and means. Why do we call them grassroots? I think it was a century ago when the concept was first used, which means from the soil up, which means it's not directed by any kind of elite. And that's why I stick to the concept of the Arab Spring, regardless of what this and that American academic agrees or disagrees. Because the Arab Spring is not an event. The Arab Spring is more than an event. It's more than a movement. It is an era that we live in. That's why 2011, 2019 are two phases of the same era of the Arab Spring, except that people of Algeria and people of Sudan and even people of Iraq, to a large degree, and Lebanon, have learned from the lessons of 2011, and now they mobilize more peacefully, they mobilize more intelligently, because now people understand from what happened in Libya and Syria and other places that an eye for an eye leaves everyone blind, that in the end of the day, there are no winners of civil wars. And I learned a bit of that, Sami, when I was in New York right after the Arab Spring, when I heard the great professor and Nobel winner, Joseph Stiglitz, economist, talking to the Occupy movement in New York, in the middle of Wall Street. And I heard him say, we are all inspired by the Arab Spring. Why? Because of this very particular leaderless, popular mobilization of people demanding positive change, demanding justice, freedom, and certainly less tyranny of the elite and more voice for themselves in the governing of their countries.
All right, I think we've just got about 2 minutes left. So what I'm going to try and do is give each of our remaining two guests a minute each, and let's try and look forward to 2020. Remi, where do you see this rebellion against the elite, if we can summarize it like that? Where do you see it leading the world?
Well, I think at least there's some clarity in terms really of the dissatisfaction across the globe and those popular protests. But the thing is, there's no really clear path forward. There's no real the mobilization hasn't led in any country to really something very concrete in terms of an alternative model or in terms of reforms. And now we're on the brink of a new financial crisis on a global scale. And we might see the situation deteriorate further for the working class, for people that have been most affected by the previous crisis and people who are most dissatisfied already at the moment. So I'm concerned that things in some areas can get again out of control, and there's really at the start of the debate on many key issues, but that's really still not enough. And those movements are often very decentralized, and there's really a need for the elite across the globe to really reflect on these issues and on a more the way to a more balanced economic and social model.
I think we've got a minute left. Let me try and give a final minute as well to Mohammed Cherkaoui. Where does 2020 take us, and will it unseat the global elites, Mohammed?
I would foresee more decline of the nation state, the political party, and the whole economic force of capitalism. At the same time, the social society agents or agents of social change in the middle level, the intellectuals, the protesters will be gaining more momentum. And therefore, I think it will be a year of political negotiation between these top-down versus bottom-up forces trying to stimulate a compromise. And I'm not sure that the old guardians of the political system in the Arab world will be able to deliver much. Therefore, I think we may see another wave of protests, and we may even see some governments that will be toppled down.
All right, I think we've just got, Marwan, 5 seconds.
I just think there's no end game for what goes on today. I think this is the nature and the spirit of our times.
All right, thank you very much. I'm afraid we are out of time, although it is a fascinating topic. I'm sure we can talk about it for hours to come. Let's thank our guests, Marwan here in the studio, Remi, and of course, Mohammed. And thank you for watching. You can see the show again anytime by heading over to our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, just head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here, for now, it's goodbye.